Sup guys, this is the carrier tier list update video. There aren't as many changes here as the Vanguard version since there just aren't as many additions, but the state of battleships do have a small impact on how carriers play out as well, since they're competing for the same slots in the fleet. I keep them separate just because I feel like they're different enough in terms of their gameplay mechanics, namely the anti-air resistance that carriers have to go through, and the time frame of their damage delivery. It's a lot more difficult to do head-to-head comparisons between carriers and battleships, the same way they can be done between a destroyer and a large cruiser, for instance Laffy 2 and Guam, or Eldridge and A-Gear. For this update, I've added 2 new tiers, one for healers because Unicorn does have a little competition now, and then another one that's just for the best Chapter 15 support fleet anti-air supports. The relative order of ships haven't changed that much, but I'll highlight the small changes here and there, as well as the difference in the cutoff of tiers. First, I moved Fritz-Rume up ahead of Amagi and Shinano. The reason for this is because of her flexibility, asking nothing of the other ships in your fleet while applying a universal damage debuff for them, making her much easier to run alongside battleships, which currently have much more incentive to be used as compared to before. Shinano and Amagi still fry heavy armor much harder than Fritz-Rume, but Rume has them beat in essentially everything else. I have Shinano ahead of Amagi right now, even though I do acknowledge that there will likely be optimal boss compositions that will feature Amagi as a solo IGN carrier without Shinano, just because we're at this rare moment in time where half of the strongest ships in the game aren't IGN, and even sortieing just 3 IGN ships could end up being a tough ask. Enjoy it while it lasts. I still give the nod to Shinano though, just because she's much tankier and has a ton of useful buffs for destroyers, which makes her a lot better in campaign than Amagi. And also with a sprinkle of personal bias on top. When I moved Amagi ahead of Shinano previously, I forgot to account for her strength in the campaign and just tunneled on Amagi's self-sufficiency. But as I've hammered home many times, a single spot doesn't really make a world of difference. Next up is Independence. I've made a video spotlighting her capabilities, so go to the description and give that a watch if you're wondering why there's a single purple retrofit among a sea of URs. Next up is Yorktown 2, whose niche is damage against light armor, with also decent damage against medium and good anti-air, but she can't do all of these at the same time. Not only does she force you to bring at least 3 USS ships in your fleet, which USS is just not in the best spot right now, fingers crossed for this upcoming anniversary. There's just too much competition in her role now, with Fritz-Rume, Alsace, Lion, Mecklenburg, Bismarck's Way, Vanguard, and so on. She's still a top performer if the situation allows you to run Eldridge and Kearsarge to support her without sacrificing much, but even when everything lines up, she's still not the best at her job. After that is Implacable, who has fallen off a little bit. Some might have thought that Implacable would be immune to power creep, but the developers never promised she was going to be the only ship that would make with a powerful movement impairment ability. With ships like Eldridge, Soyuz, Nakimov, and Bismarck's Way, and if you're using Bismarck's Way then Fritz-Rume as well, who have enough slow support to guarantee most of your damage lands, Implacable has been slowly losing value due to her lack of damage compared to the competition. Still, she is at no risk of slipping out of S tier anytime soon, as the ships in the lower tiers are not quite strong enough to give her a run for her money. Haku has had her entire existence replaced by Amagi, but she's still a stub above the carriers in A tier, so she's sticking around for now. If new and more powerful dive bombers are introduced, there's a good chance she'll move up the ranks. The first 4 carriers are by far the strongest currently. Independence is a bit of a special case. Then, there's a gap, and these 3 are stronger than the A tiers, but not as useful as the other S tiers. But they still deserve to stay in S. For healers, Unicorn is generally the best due to her consistency. Zuiho feels like she does just as well, if not better, when running low HP Vanguards, which is quite common these days with most of the best Vanguard ships in campaign being destroyers. I don't think her lack of preload is that important, because the fights go on for pretty long when you're pushing through those late game chapters for the first time. Sometimes I've noticed that I kill a node a bit too fast, like seconds before Zuiho's next heal goes off, which could make it feel like she's not healing enough, whereas Unicorn is guaranteed an extra one with her preload. But if you just pay a bit of attention to your fights, you can either decrease your damage by just a little bit, not too much, or make Zuiho a little faster so that you can squeeze out that last heal more consistently. I still wouldn't use Unicorn and Zuiho together because their damage is on the low side, but it's not a death sentence if you do. Aquila is more of a secondary healer, and her standout feature is her focus healing on the main fleet, which synergizes very well with Musashi's skill that absorbs all damage onto herself. Usually, you'll probably want to use her with Unicorn and Zuiho as the main healer, but nowadays there are quite a lot of sources of healing from the likes of Raffaello, Provincian, and so on, so if your fleet just happens to have a ton of extra healing here and there, maybe you can get away with Aquila as the solo healer, but I would still recommend running a primary healer instead. A quick word on Claudia. She's a collab character from a series I've never touched, and she's not sexy like Yumiya, so I'm not going to pretend like I even care, but from what I've heard, she is very good. She'll probably get a rerun soon with the Yumiya collab, so you can give her a try, but I'm going to stick to these three who are not only capable, but also some of my favorite ships in the game as a whole. Next, let's move on to the A tier. Centaur and Shokaku with their recent augments now deal the same amount of personal damage as the stronger ships in A and B tier, while at the same time having damage buffs for other ships in the fleet, which, if you're using them with stronger UR ships, would be very valuable. Centaur is a bit better, because not only does she deal more damage, but she also has insane reload, allowing her to get the same cooldown using 2 LA9s as other carriers using 2 BF109Gs. HMS ships are also in at the moment, so it allows her to fulfill her HMS requirement quite easily. Shokaku doesn't have as much reload, but deals more damage against heavy armor with her focus on torpedo bombers, and her buff also helps the Vanguard. Her biggest weakness, though, is that she has a dive bomber slot. Dive bombers are currently the worst plane type, having the unfortunate combination of poor consistency, lower aviation scaling, and the only dive bombers that deal real damage also have the longest cooldown. Between two ships that are otherwise very close in performance, the one with more dive bombers is going to end up being worse in most cases, until much better planes are introduced for the slot. If you don't quite understand why this is the case, check out my in-depth plane guides, especially the one where I talk about the strengths and weaknesses of each plane type. I explain why exactly dive bombers are generally the weakest type as of now. By the way, their augments supposedly increase their plane efficiencies by 10%, but these are currently bugged and only provide an increase of 1% to the plane efficiency. This means they are slightly weaker than they should be, but they're not missing 10% of their damage, as it's not a 10% efficiency increase over 100% base, and for Centaur in particular, some of her damage comes from barrages as well, so it's just a little bit of damage they're missing, but doesn't really change how they stack up to other ships. With all that being said, Haku is still closer to Amagi than she is to these two, so they are gate-kept out of S tier. Next, Arc Roll and AVP are both consistent movement impairment options to increase the consistency of your attacks. They have no place in optimal fleets because they're directly outclassed by options in higher tiers like Implacable, Nakhimov, and Soyuz, but they're very accessible, and having them means you can prioritize resources into higher damaging ships before slow support ones. The last ship in A tier is Chkalov. She deals a lot of damage against heavy armor, and she's okay against medium armor. I debated dropping her down to B tier as well, because I was a little disappointed by her performance in the Nagato meta and Taiho meta fights, but it was in comparison with the other S tier options, so that's a little bit unfair. She's tailored toward heavy armor busting, so she doesn't really need fighters, but she still has way too much of a reliance on dive bombers, which, as I've mentioned, is currently the weakest plane type, and if she had a 2 dive bomber and 6 torpedo bomber split like Arc Royal, instead of a 4 and 4 split, she would feel much better to use. With her Fate Simulation upgrade, she also did gain a slow, but it's weaker in strength than Arc Royals, more importantly only lasts 3 seconds as opposed to Arc Royal 6, so I would not rely on it as the only slow in the fleet. Now we move on to the B tier. Franklin, Shangri-La, and Enterprise are all very powerful, all-rounder, damage-oriented carriers. They have one of each plane type in their loadout, so they end up not specializing against any one type of enemy. Enterprise in particular prefers to not go against heavy armor because all of her damage comes from her planes, and they all only have 2 torpedo bombers. But the other two don't care because they have powerful barrages that are better against heavy. The order here is purely based off their consistency, as Franklin doesn't have much of a reliance on RNG. Shangri-La has an 80% chance to activate Barrage, but still a ton of damage buffs even without it, while Enterprise's damage lives and dies by a 70% coin toss. Next, Saratoga is a bit of a special carrier in that while her airstrike is not weak by any means, she adds a lot more damage by her timed barrages that activate every 10 seconds. She's not that useful in boss fleets, but I like to use her in the mob fleet of Operation Siren to add a bit more damage uptime at essentially no cost, and she is solid in campaign as well. Next, Volga is a secondary healer similar to Aquila, but her consistency is a bit lacking in comparison. If her heal was changed so that random ticks could not target ships that have full HP, she would instantly shoot up to the healer tier, but the way she is currently, I can't put her in the same tier as Zuiho, and her damage output is closer to that of conventional carriers anyway. Next, Illustrious is similar to Volga, where you can't really consider her a full healer, but her shields do increase the survivability of your vanguards, while her fighter-focused loadout increases the survivability of your main fleet against planes. While she has unconventional strengths and likely won't be anyone's first choice for building a fleet, if you do care to use her, I think she can be very effective. For example, I'm currently running her in my daily 13-4 hard mode fleet, where I can't really use any fewer ships than I'm using due to the high stat requirements, but she makes the runs fully consistent while not costing as much as a rainbow ship. The final ship in B tier is Albion, whose loadout allows her to have the best possible setup against either light or medium armor enemies, out-damaging pretty much all the ships that didn't make it onto the tier list against those armor types. Being a light carrier, she also has very high reload, which makes adjusting her cooldowns very easy. Finally, in the to be determined tier, I have Glorious Meta and Peter Strasser. I still haven't found a good opportunity to use Glorious Meta, and I'm not particularly enthusiastic about raising her level cap to 125, but she has a lot of damage buffs and would likely land in A tier above the USS carriers for sheer damage output, if I had to guess. Peter Strasser is a bit of a special case. She can root the enemy like AVP and her damage is solid, but she is extremely restrictive in team building, so I want to use her against a medium armor boss first before making a judgment. Her main selling point is that she reduces the cooldown of the first 3 airstrikes of Ironblood carriers by 10%, which would pair the best with Fritz Rume, allowing Rume to potentially unleash 4 airstrikes with double LA9s equipped. She requires 3 other Ironblood ships, which is fine because alongside Rume, Bismarck's Way and Z52 are also amazing options, not to mention Hindenburg if you're indeed using them against medium armor. Although this does mean that you wouldn't be using Mecklenburg or the myriad of other amazing non-Ironblood main fleet ships. Her route being 3 seconds means the timing of your attacks must be extremely precise to take advantage of her damage buff against rooted enemies, which could end up being a pain to execute. The movement impairment aspect of it is good enough though, with Rume herself having a strong slow when paired with Bismarck Sway's Black Hole. Unfortunately, she's not the best against a light armor with a lot of torpedo bombers in her loadout, and then Rume is not the best against heavy armor with her fighter-focused loadout, so not only is the fleet setup very specific, but the use case is also very specific as well. Her kit is extremely powerful though, and I'll be keeping her in the back of my mind when the next Ironblood carrier comes out. As for the ships that I removed since the last version, Taiho's just not that important anymore with Shokaku, Ark Royal Chkalov, and Franklin, most of them being relatively easy to obtain, but she's still a solid option, especially if you like her character design. Soryu meta is similar to Saratoga, but I don't think she's really needed when Saratoga exists and is easier to obtain and cheaper to upgrade. Also, she's a meta ship, which I don't care that much about, and I'll probably never raise her to 125, so it's not really feasible for me to do actual head-to-head comparisons to make sure she's really up to par. One last thing I wanted to point out was how many beautiful white or silverish hair carriers there are. Not really sure why that is. And that about wraps up all the changes for the carrier tier list. Go check out the Vanguard tier list update if you haven't already, linked in the description, and the battleship one should be dropping in the near future as well. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next one.